Hi, my name is Justin Shelp and I'm the founder here at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates in Microsoft Configuration Manager and Intune. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, we're going to be specifically looking at different scenarios within Config Manager where you may want to either reinstall your WSUS server by completely rebuilding it, as well as different scenarios where you may want to move your front-end WSUS server to a different server. So we're going to be looking at three different scenarios. I'll go ahead and turn off my video at this point so we can simply focus on the content. But here's the three different scenarios that we're going to be looking at. Number one, it's going to be a full WSUS rebuild, but you use the existing server that WSUS is already on and the software update point is already on. So we'll dig into that first. We're also going to talk about what if you want to migrate the WSUS server to an entirely new server, but you do want to migrate the database, the content during that migration. So you don't want to have to rebuild from scratch. You don't want to have your clients rescan the entire database again. And you also want to migrate things like your content, which generally speaking for WSUS with a config manager integration would usually be things like third-party updates. And then lastly, what we're going to look at is what if you want to migrate your front-end server and your content to a new server. So this would be if you're using an existing config manager software update point that's using a shared database. So for example, in the third scenario, the database is going to stay on the exact same remote SQL server. You simply want to remove that WSUS front-end and content to a new location. So these were the three big ones that I could kind of think of scenarios where you're either changing and or rebuilding WSUS that I think will cover just about all the scenarios that you may come across in this specific situations. So with that said, let's jump in. Now, the first thing I do want to talk about is scenario one. In my opinion, this often is not needed. So rebuilding from scratch, it is oftentimes a overkill, specifically if you're doing it because performance issues. So with that said, I do want to cover some of the things that I would generally recommend looking at if you're purely rebuilding an existing server and you're reusing the existing server and you just want to rebuild WSUS to start clean because you think the performance is not doing well, right? So before I would do something like this, I would look at a couple of different things. First, did you change the IIS configuration for WSUS to the recommended settings? So to do this, I'm going to include a link to this guide, but essentially out of the box with WSUS, it's under spec from an IIS app pool perspective. So first thing I would do is go and make sure that's configured correctly. So what we would do here, we'd open up IIS. We would go to the app pools, and then we would look at the WSUS pool. Go ahead and do advanced settings. Now, by default, the queue length is 1000 by default. So the recommended setting for that is going to be 2000. So make sure we set that first. And then the memory limit is actually scoped pretty low. So if we look back here, by default, it's about 1.8 meg or so. So they either recommend setting that to 0, which means it's unlimited and it can use as much memory that's available for it, or you can also set it to basically 4 times. So that's a different KB article that mentions the 4 times. But for this video, what we'll do is set it unlimited. So if we come down here, see if I can find it. So here's the private memory limit. We would want to set that to 0. And then there's a couple of other settings around the idle timeout here as well. So we would set the idle timeout to 0. See if we can find that. 0. We would make the ping enabled equal to false. There we go. And then lastly, the load user profile, make sure that's false as well. Looks like these are kind of the recommended settings. So if you did not set that, that's a good start to make sure performance is better. So we'll go ahead and do OK on that. And then recycle the app pool to make sure that takes effect. So what we did here is essentially change some of the front-end IIS settings. So this will mostly impact the client scanning that's going over IIS. This can help things like make sure the app pool does not stop because it ran out of resources and or crashed. So this is a great first step. Make sure that you're using the recommended changes as compared to a default installation. Now the second one that can have a huge impact is whether or not you're running any type of maintenance on WSUS. So first step for that would be going into your software update point and then looking at the maintenance. So this was originally introduced, I believe, in 1806, and then there were more functionality enabled for the cleanup in 1906. So this is kind of the second step. So at kind of a core level is what this will do is if there are updates declined, this will have a pretty big impact. Or I'm sorry, if updates are superseded, so we'll look at the supersedence rules as well, but if they're superseded, this will allow ConfigMgr to decline that update in WSUS. So if you've never declined superseded updates, it's not uncommon for about 80% of the updates in your catalog to be superseded because there's a newer update that's replaced it. So that would be, the impact there would be clients will scan against superseded updates, but they won't scan against declined updates. So if this isn't enabled, simply enabling this will probably clean out a large amount of updates from your catalog that clients will no longer scan against, which will make the performance much better from a client and IS perspective for that scanning. The second one is adding indexes to the WSUS database. So this is more of like a performance when it's doing declining, and it just improves the overall performance within the ConfigMan or the WSUS database. And I'll include some links of kind of where this was found as well. And then lastly, if there are any obsolete updates, it can clean that up from the database as well. So before rebuilding, if these were not enabled, I would definitely recommend that. And then during the next scheduled sync is when this cleanup would actually be performed for wsyncmgr. And then lastly, the supersedence. So by default, I want to say it's set to expire superseded updates every 3 months. Or expire superseded updates, I should say. So essentially where that comes into play is for your WSUS maintenance, this is saying, do you want to decline expired updates from the WSUS database that are expired in ConfigMan? So if your supersedence schedule is set to something like, do not expire superseded updates until it's been superseded for a specific number of times or a specific number of months. So for example, we've actually seen customers where this has been set to 99, not really knowing the impact. So what this would essentially say is, and 3 months is a pretty good option, I think, for most environments. What that will say is, let's say that there's a cumulative update that came out in June 2021, right? And then let's say 3 months down the road, that would be when it says, hey, this June update has been superseded for 3 months. Let me go ahead and expire that so it can then be cleaned up from WSUS. So if you set this to something very high, like 99, for example, you're going to essentially have these updates living in WSUS forever. So that can have a big impact where they're not ever getting cleaned up, and you have clients scanning against updates that in reality are never going to be applicable, and they're not going to be applied because there's been superseded newer updates that take place of those. All right, so that's the first three things. Like if any of these are not set, there's probably a good chance you can get a very good performance increase by just enabling these different steps. But let's say that you've decided, hey, I want to completely rebuild anyways. I want to reinstall my WSUS server and totally rebuild. So first thing to note is that we can see things are, pretty simple. I've only got Windows 10 enabled, and I've only got kind of the latest one showing up. And I've already kind of removed and expired any superseded updates. So overall, my catalog's pretty small to begin with, and that should be helpful just for the rebuild not to take so long. But within this environment, what we have going on is it's pretty simple. It's one of our labs. So we've got our site server, and this is also running that WSUS top-level software update point as well. So in this scenario, we say, hey, I'm not happy with my WSUS install. I'm going to want to go ahead and just rebuild this from scratch. So first thing that I would recommend is we'll go into your software update point, and you're going to want to take a note of which categories that you have enabled. So this should actually stay checked as you rebuild things, but maybe not a bad idea just to understand what you have enabled. Now, second thing that might not be a bad idea is if you completely rebuild from scratch, if you've got any third-party catalogs enabled, these are going to be completely wiped out. So prior to uninstalling, kind of rebuilding your software update point, not a bad idea to just go ahead and uncheck these because they're going to basically get wiped out during the reinstallation anyways. So we'll go ahead and uncheck that. And if you're on an older build of ConfigMgr, there's actually an issue where if you've got products enabled in ConfigMan, like third-party products, and they don't exist in WSUS, which they won't when we rebuild it, it can actually cause the WCM component that configures WSUS not to work when you rebuild your WSUS server. Now, this is not in newer builds of current branch. I want to say within, I don't know, maybe 2010. They did make it so it won't completely fail the configuration, which would break sync. But older builds, it would cause issues where if you had something still checked in your SUP and it didn't exist on WSUS when it was reinstalled, it would cause it not to configure WSUS, which you could see it pretty clearly in WCM, and you just have to come back in and uncheck it. But if you do know, hey, I'm going to be rebuilding WSUS completely, not a bad idea to just go ahead and uncheck these updates. All right, now in this specific scenario, since we did have third-party updates enabled and we just unchecked that vendor, what I'm going to do is go ahead and synchronize my software update point. Now, you could also do this step when WSUS is reinstalled, but if you know you have third-party updates, whether it's a product like PatchMyPC, which is our product, whether it's Dell drivers, whether it's another third-party vendor, it probably makes sense to go ahead and clean those third-party updates out of your ConfigMan database prior to the reinstall of WSUS. So what I did is I started a software update point sync. So if I go ahead and look at my ConfigMan logs, let me just check my desktop. So we're going to wait for that sync to complete. So hopefully your WSUS isn't in a state where it's so bad you can't sync at all. But we'll come back here in about 3-4 minutes once this completes, and we'll show you what the third-party updates look like in ConfigMgr and explain why we want to clean these out of the ConfigMgr database prior to reinstalling our SUP and WSUS. All right, so that sync looks like it is now complete. It is doing some of the deletion and cleanup of WSUS at the moment, but I think we've synchronized enough that we can come back into our software update point, all software updates, and then choose refresh. All right, so this looks pretty good. So we can actually see, since the last time I synchronized, we did get some new Microsoft updates. But we can see now that we've unchecked in our specific scenario the PatchMyPC vendor for third-party updates, these updates are now showing with a gray icon. So what we would actually want to do is make sure that none of the third-party updates are deployed, because what we're going to do is actually purge those out of the ConfigMgr database. And the reason that we want to do this is if you come back in once you've reinstalled WSUS, any of the third-party updates that you've either subscribed to via the console, so for example, driver catalogs, or if you're using our product, which would be our publisher, or if you're using any other third-party vendor, these updates are actually going to have to get completely rebuilt when WSUS is reinstalled. Now, there is an issue that comes into play is since the updates will have the same unique ID, if they still exist in the ConfigMgr database, it can cause some hash issues because when the updates are actually rebuilt from whichever tool you're using for third-party updates, those updates are actually going to be re-signed using your WSUS signing certificate. So what will happen if they're already existing in ConfigMgr and they already exist in deployment packages, those updates will actually have hash errors on the client because the hash in WSUS, when you rebuild it, will be the new hash, but the actual binary that exists in your deployment package would still be detected as downloaded, which would be the previous WSUS signing cert that you used to publish before you rebuilt WSUS. So that's why we want to make sure that we clean these out of ConfigMgr so that they fully resync when we rebuild WSUS. All right, so a couple things that we want to do here. We want to make sure that they're not in any update group. So for example, a quick way you could do this is look at vendor, and then you could basically add any vendor that's not PatchMyPC, or I'm sorry, not Microsoft. That would be third-party updates. Quick way that you can then do this is you can select all the updates that are not Microsoft and then edit membership. We can then uncheck any software update groups that they're a part of, right? So we could simply uncheck. This method's helpful if you have a lot of different software update groups and different third-party updates. Now, if, for example, you know, hey, all my third-party updates, they're in a very specific software update group, a quick method could also be simply to delete the software update group. Now, the next thing that you want to make sure is you want to go into any deployment packages that you've downloaded these third-party updates into and delete them from that. What that's going to ensure is that when these updates get republished or rebuilt, essentially, that they don't have content that ConfigMgr thinks is already downloaded. So you'd go through all the deployment packages that you have third-party updates in and make sure that you've removed those updates from that deployment package. Now at this point, we should see that all the third-party updates should be expired as long as you uncheck them and ran that sync, and they should all be not downloaded and not deployed or part of an update group. Now once this is performed, we can then purge these updates out of the ConfigMgr database to ensure that there's no metadata left over when we completely rebuild WSUS. So this actually happens by default every 7 days for expired updates in ConfigMgr. As long as they're not part of a software update group, there's a maintenance task that will delete any expired updates within 7 days of them becoming expired. Now, since we're trying to get this all done in 1 day, we want to rebuild everything. What we can essentially do is we can call the stored procedure that actually runs to purge out expired updates directly in ConfigMgr. And the only thing we're doing is adjusting. So by default, it says 7 for the integer for days, which would be how long does an update have to be expired in the number of days before ConfigMgr purges it out of the updates database for your ConfigMgr database. So what I'm doing is adjusting this to say, let's delete any expired update right away. So let's take a look to see what happened here. Let's refresh. Okay, cool. So it looks like that purge happened. So we don't see any of the PatchMyPC updates. So this looks good. So you want to make sure that those third-party updates are no longer showing up. Now, another thing that I would recommend is if you're subscribed to any third-party update catalog, simply unsubscribe to them until we're ready and fully rebuilt our WSUS server. If you're using PatchMyPC, for example, what we would simply do is take note of your current sync schedule, and then we would disable the automated sync. This will just ensure third-party updates aren't trying to republish before we fully have WSUS rebuilt and we're at a point where we're ready to redo our updates. So this is kind of unique to scenario 1, specifically because we're rebuilding everything from scratch. So third-party updates are one of the big things that come into play because when you rebuild, it's basically going to have to republish the update with a new cert. But Microsoft updates, for example, don't have all these steps involved because nothing actually changes for the content that we download from Microsoft. They're still going to come from the same exact download URL. So this caveat for third-party updates really come into play more so when you're completely wiping the database and starting over. It won't be quite as complex, I would say, probably for scenario 2 and 3, where we're migrating the database and content. But this is an important step if you're using any type of third-party updates to ensure that you're not getting hash errors when things rebuild. All right, so with that said, what we're going to do next is basically take our database offline for WSUS. All right, so to do that, actually let's uninstall WSUS first. So if I go to Server Manager, go ahead and remove our role. Oh, there we go. Remove, and we're going to take off WSUS. Now, it might be a good idea to kind of take note of what your current setup looks like. So for example, we can see it's using the SUSDB, the SQL Server is demo 1, which is the box we're on. And here's our content directory for WSUS, JWSUS. So maybe get a quick screenshot of that just in case something goes wrong or you need to reference it. So what we're going to do is basically take everything off. So uncheck WSUS. We'll do next here. We'll do next here. And we'll say restart if needed and then remove. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it while I remove this feature. Now, one thing that I will note is I'm not actually going to uninstall my software update role within ConfigMgr, software update point. If I were to do that, and this was the last software update point, what would essentially happen is the WSUS server that's actually on client, let me see if I can find this real quick. So the client setting that actually sets the policy for where it should be pointing to for WSUS will completely remove. So if I go under Microsoft, Windows Update, what would happen is if I remove my SUP, it would actually clear out this data. So it would no longer be trying to scan internally, and that would cause it to go directly out to Windows Update. So depending on your environment, that could potentially be an issue if all your machines all started to scan and install updates that maybe you didn't necessarily approve or want. But it does look like the server has started to reboot, so we'll come right back up when we're logged in. All right, so the WSUS components within Server Manager are now completely removed. Now, the next step that we want to do is go ahead and clear out or basically delete the database from SQL Management Studio, assuming that you're using a SQL database. That's going to allow us to rebuild everything from scratch. All right, so I've connected in and I'm going to go ahead and do properties. And you want to go ahead and take a note of where your database exists. So in my case, both the database and the log file exist in the same directory. And we just want to take note of that. So next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and choose to detach the database. So we're going to take it offline, detach. We're going to drop any connections. We're not going to worry about updating stats. We don't really care. This database is essentially going away. So go ahead and detach it so it's no longer connected. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and go to the location where it existed. All right, so I've got the database files. What I'm going to do is go ahead and cut these because if we've reinstalled WSUS, it's probably going to put it in the default location that SQL Server is assigning the database to. So there's a good chance, if you don't have anything pre-created for your SUSDB, it may try to use the existing database file. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these. So Control X, and then I'm just going to take a backup. Not a bad idea. I'll just put it on the desktop and say SUSDB, backup, just in case something happened and you wanted to try to go back to the previous SUS database if something didn't go well in the rebuild. Good idea to kind of have a backup here. So if we look back in the default location where SQL is storing the database, we no longer have SUSDB. So next step that we want to do is go ahead and open up Server Manager, and we're going to basically do a clean install of WSUS. So we'll go ahead and choose, everything that we have here, WSUS. Now, one thing that I will note is during this period where things are not kind of ready to reinstall, nothing will be working from an update perspective. So for example, if I look at WCM.log on the site server, it's going to say, hey, I can't connect to WSUS. I'm going to throw an error. So during this point, you're going to see errors. Your software update point will be in a bad state if you're looking at monitoring. And then if we jump over to our client, so this is a client machine scanning against that SUP that we basically just uninstalled WSUS. Any of the scans that are happening are, they're going to start erroring out. So it's going to say, unable to connect, which will be normal, right? Because WSUS isn't actually running. It's not going to have a location where the client can scan. And that's all okay. If you only have one SUP and you're totally rebuilding it, you absolutely are going to have some downtime when you've reinstalled WSUS. All right, so jumping back, we're going to go ahead and go back to Server Manager. We're going to reinstall WSUS. Now, before we do this, I'm going to go ahead and rename my previous WSUS folder. So we'll call it WSUS.old, I guess. That's whatever you want to call it. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the same folder that I used before, JWSUS. So this folder, once you're kind of fully rebuilt and good, you can likely delete this. This will be where any of the old third-party updates and or EULAs would exist in that content folder. So it could be pretty large if you did have a lot of third-party updates. So we'll just back that up just in case, and then we're going to basically set a new clean folder that we use for the reinstall. So for here, we do want to use a SQL Server. We're not using a Windows internal database. We're basically going to map back to that SQL Server that we deleted the database from. For our content, I'm going to use that JWSUS drive locally here. And for our database, demo1.contoso.local, that's our SQL Server that we're going to be basically reinstalling to. Go ahead and choose install, and we'll wait for this to complete. All right, so the installation is now complete. So we're going to go ahead and run our post-install task for WSUS that will actually configure the database. So this will also take probably a couple minutes or so. So we'll come back once that post-install succeeds. And basically during this step, it's creating the database. So we should see here in a couple minutes, we'll see the SUSDB come into play. And yeah, we'll come back once this is done. All right, so we can see it's getting pretty close to being done. It's already, oh, there we go. So it's already created the database. We can see it configuring IIS. So at this point, it looks like post-install completed. Now, one thing that we are going to do is basically come back into IIS. And we want to make sure that the app pool settings are configured as best practice. So if we come back in and look, we can see it looks like that's 2000. Looks like the memory limit is already 0. So it looks like it was able to retain the settings that we had prior to our reinstall. But you might want to double check to make sure that if there are any configurations that were lost based on the best practice link that we did before, that they're also configured here. So at this point, we have WSUS kind of freshly installed. Now, if we go ahead and look back at WCM.log, what we're going to notice is it's basically the software update point won't retry, connecting to WSUS for every 60 minutes. So what we're going to do to kind of force that to happen a little quicker, you could restart the entire SMS executive service. That would trigger that component to start. We'll be a little bit less, less invasive for that. And if we come under administration, it's monitoring. Where is this at? This always loses me. System status, there we go. So if we come to component status, we can start the configuration manager service manager component. So that's going to show you all the different components running on the site server. And then basically what we can do, we can stop the WSUS configuration manager component, which is what tries to connect to WSUS. So we'll see, click query, we can then click stop. And then we'll see in this log file, it's then going to stop that component. Now, if we query again, we can then start it back up. There we go, and then we can start it. So now that WSUS is reinstalled, what we're hoping for here is that it's able to connect into the WSUS database. Now, one thing to note here is that WSUS is not fully synchronized at this point. So if we actually come in and look at your WSUS console, we'll cancel out of here. But there's going to be basically not a whole lot here because we haven't synchronized from Windows Update yet. So you're going to have a lot of products missing potentially. So if we come back in, we can see that it's trying to configure the different products that we had enabled before. So we can see, here's the category. And one important thing to note is that we had Windows 10 enabled 1903 or later, but we can see it's not found on WSUS. And the reason for that is because the WSUS was entirely rebuilt. So what we'll notice here, we'll wait till this comes back in 1 minute, and then we'll take a note of what's actually happened here. All right, so we can see that the configuration is at least now complete from that perspective. And this is specifically where I was saying, if there's a product in WSUS that does not exist, if there's a product enabled in your SUP that's not in WSUS, this is actually where it used to fail. But now what happens is it's able to handle that, but it also causes some issues where, for example, if we come in and look, it looks like it's still trying to select that update, but we can see it's in fact, there's nothing going to be that actually comes of that because it hasn't synchronized yet. So what we're going to try to look at is go ahead and synchronize our software update point. And what this should do is it should basically trigger WSUS to pull the latest catalog from Windows Update. So we'll come back in. Let's take a look here. We'll see if WCMGr is actually kicked off yet. All right, so here we go. It's starting the first synchronization. Now, one thing to note here, this first synchronization can take quite a while because it's got to pull all the categories from the latest Windows Update catalog, because as we can see, it's missing quite a lot of products. So I'm going to pause this. This is going to take some time, and we'll come back once we have a status of what it's doing. All right, so the synchronization has completed, but one thing that I've actually seen happen quite a few times is the first sync when you have ConfigMgr trying to reconfigure WSUS to do its initial category sync plus a sync to ConfigMgr. Although it kind of looks like it's successful, what I actually have noticed is the WSync says that it was canceled. It took about 25 minutes or so. We can see the sync running. It certainly got some metadata from the catalog because if we come back into our software update point, we do have a little bit more data. So we can see over here, we have our software update point. And there are more products that have synchronized down, but it's certainly not a full list. So for example, we can certainly see that Windows 10, usually you have a bunch of different categories here. So it didn't do a full sync because for whatever reason, it either canceled because of a timeout or because of the way that ConfigMgr tried to configure maybe the first sync. But either way, I have seen this happen quite a bit. When you do a initial synchronization. So what I think I'm going to do here, if we come back into our console, let's come back into our component and configuration manager. So let's come back over here. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the WSync manager just to stop that thread. And we're going to stop the configuration manager as well, the WSUS configuration manager. So we'll go ahead and stop. And I'll pause it while I go through these different routines here. Alrighty, so just kind of stopped and restarted those. So if I come back to my logs, let me just open WCM because that's kind of the big one I'm kind of curious about. Just make sure that it looks like it's still connected and okay. Okay, so there we go. So it's kind of looking at the connection and it's going to do the 1 minute sleep after it tries to add the Windows 10 category. Now we can see, in fact, it's still not fully configured on WSUS, meaning that it's not found for Windows 10. So that first synchronization that we triggered via all software updates did not, in fact, sync the whole catalog. So we could try this again, and we could run a sync directly from all software updates, and this would eventually come down and it would work. But one thing I'm going to go ahead and do is just actually try it from WSUS itself. Just make sure that you don't have a scheduled sync kind of coming up soon. Otherwise, it would essentially try to do the same thing. But one option that you could potentially even do this before you try to trigger a sync in WSUS is we can run the WSUS configuration wizard. Now, we're not going to go fully through this because we're not in standalone WSUS mode. But essentially, what we're doing here is trying to pull down the categories. So the options will just kind of keep default. And this is the big piece where it says download the Windows Update information. So when this starts connecting, this is essentially pulling down the catalog of what are the latest categories and or products available from the Windows Update catalog to pull into WSUS. So if you wanted to, if you're up to this point in the video, just because I do see the first sync fail quite frequently when ConfigMan tries to trigger it on a newly rebuilt WSUS, you could come and open the wizard and just try to get the initial catalog synchronized. And then at that point, we could then try to sync in ConfigMgr, which would then, it should see the category for Windows 10, 1903 and later if that was enabled, as well as have all the categories up to date. So this will probably take 10-15 minutes to pull down the latest categories, and we'll come back and kind of see how ConfigMgr is interacting now. All right, so it probably took about 15-20 minutes or so for this to do the first synchronization. So I'm going to go ahead and click cancel because we don't actually want to go through and configure WSUS. And now we can see that that second synchronization that we initiated just to configure the categories and products did finish successfully. So may not be a bad idea if you are reinstalling it just to go ahead and run that initial sync to pull down all the products and classifications. just using WSUS maybe before you even come into ConfigMgr. So for example, now we can see we have the entire list of products within the catalog. So here's all our Windows 10 stuff. So this looks pretty good. So now what I'm going to do, just to get our product to kind of configure over to ConfigMgr, we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to stop the WSUS Configuration Manager component. So we'll just click on that. All right, then we're going to query, not the most intuitive here. So we can see that component just shut down. And this would happen every hour where it would kind of recheck and try to reconfigure it. And then we're going to start the component. So we should see it picking up here. Yep, and we should see it try to configure that product. And what we're hoping for this time is not to get this error message that says, hey, it's not found on WSUS. We should hopefully see that it's now configured. Yep, and now we can see configuring the categories, and we don't get the same message like we got up here when it tried to configure, where it says the category wasn't found. So this looks good. We're not getting that error, and that's because we did get our initial sync done from WSUS ahead of time. So this looks good. Now, what we're going to do next is we're actually run a sync, because at this point, even though all the updates still show in ConfigMgr, just because you know, the metadata already exists in the database, if we actually look in WSUS, because we haven't run a full synchronization since that product's been successfully configured, we'll actually see that there are no updates in WSUS. So even if clients were trying to scan against these updates that you see in ConfigMgr in the database in all software updates, they don't actually exist yet, so they wouldn't change the state even if they were needed. This is basically kind of like a cache of the last statistics that ConfigMgr had before we've rebuilt WSUS, which is totally fine, but we just want to make sure that we do get that WSUS synchronized so we can actually start seeing any changes in the state and clients can scan against WSUS. So what we'll do now that the WCM component looks good and it looks like it configured that category, we should be able to come back into our SUP, and we should see pretty much the full list of products here. And this time, Windows 10, 1903 or later, this should actually be successfully configured against WSUS now that it exists. And this looks pretty much like it did before we rebuilt WSUS. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go ahead and trigger another sync. And what we're hoping for this time in WCMgr, this should hopefully not time out. And this is going to be the first full synchronization where we start pulling down updates. So we'll see in the WCMgr it kicks off, and it's going to initiate WSUS to start syncing with Windows Update to pull down all the latest updates for the products that you would have had enabled. Now, this still might take quite a while because this is actually the first sync that's going to actually pull down the updates for the products that we have configured. So I'll pause the video and we'll come back later. All right, so the synchronization is still running. So it's currently 2:55 p.m. The sync I triggered to get the full sync running started about 2:16 or so. So it's been about 30, 40 minutes or so. And we're about 60% done with the WSUS sync. So what that means is it's going to sync the WSUS catalog, and then it's going to sync the WSUS catalog into ConfigMgr. So we're still got probably 20 or 30 minutes, but I am trying to optimize time since it is a Saturday. So what we're going to do while that's syncing is if you were using any type of third-party updates, whether it's PatchMyPC, our product, or whether it's Dell catalogs, one thing that you'll obviously notice is the products should be completely wiped out when you've reinstalled your WSUS server. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and launch our publisher. If you're using PatchMyPC, you're likely using our publisher. If you're using something like the in-console driver catalog, at this point you could probably resubscribe once that sync is done. All right, so opening up our tool, one thing to note that the certificate, since we did not actually move WSUS servers, it still existed within the cert store, so we automatically picked that up. Let me go ahead and enable debug logging. And you should still have all your configuration, assuming that you didn't wipe the server. So any of the third-party updates I had in the previous environment should now be enabled. So I'm going to go ahead and enable my sync schedule daily like it was before, and I'm going to start the synchronization. So at this point, we're going to start publishing the third-party updates into WSUS. So we'll pause it. This shouldn't take but a couple minutes or so. All right, so currently downloaded the Zoom installer, and now it's running the publishing action to WSUS. Now, generally speaking, probably would want to wait till this first sync is done, but it should be okay, just because it is under a sync. In most scenarios, I would kind of wait to run a sync until after that, but just because I am trying to optimize time, hopefully get out of here before it's too late here on a Saturday, that's why I'm trying to kick this off to hopefully save some time once this sync is completed. Alrighty, so I'm getting a bit impatient, and we are going to move on with scenario 2, but we will come back to this just to check the synchronization, make sure things look good, and show you how to enable those third-party updates within the software update point. So be sure to check out the timeline in the description below if you're only using scenario 1, where you're rebuilding a WSUS server and you want to come back to where we pick up. But next up, we're going to look at scenario 2. So this specific one, what we're going to look at is if you want to migrate from one WSUS server to a new one, but you want to reuse all your existing information like your database, your content for third-party updates, and your main goal is just moving the front-end server to a new machine. So for this scenario, what we're going to do is jump over to a new machine. So very similar environment, but this site server is called Demo 2. So if we look over here, it's very similar where we have our site server, and it's also running our software update point. So our WSUS database is also living on the same server. So in this scenario, what we want to do is say you want to move it off of this server and you want to move it to a remote site system. Could be a common scenario where you may need to export your database and content, move it to a new server, and then add that new server's new site system within ConfigMgr. So first thing that we're going to do is you want to make sure that you're not currently running a synchronization. So before we do our database backup, just make sure there's nothing kind of scheduled for a while for that next sync schedule. So what I'm going to start off by doing is we're on that main server that we're backing up that we want to move. What I'm going to do is right click our SUSDB. I'm going to choose task, and then we're just going to back up this database. So we'll choose backup. A full backup, this is all good. What I'm going to do is we'll put on our desktop just to make things simple. So let me just copy this path. Go browse out. And let's try the root of C. Depending on if UAC is enabled, you might have to run this elevated. Let's see if this works. SUSDB.bak for the backup file name, and OK. All right, so that looks good. Now, our database isn't super big. We really only have Windows 10 and a couple of third-party updates. It could take a little longer, right, if you had a lot of products enabled. But what we've got here, this is our SUSDB. Looks like it's about half a gig. So this is going to be essentially what we want to move over to what's going to be our new WSUS that we want to reuse this data for. So the remote machine, let me just jump over to this other VM. So the one that we're going to be migrating to is going to be this server called sitesystem. So basically, if we look back in our ConfigMan site, we want to move our WSUS server from Demo 2, which is also our site server, and we're going to add a new site system, and the host name of that is also named site system in this lab. So first thing, we want to get kind of WSUS up and running using the same data that currently exists on the main WSUS server that we're going to essentially be removing. So what I'm going to do is we're going to open a new window, and I should be able to just access that machine, site system, and then $. So I'm just going to copy that back file from my main WSUS server today to that remote machine, and it looks like that's all good. Now, next up, since we are going to be removing Demo 2, we do want to copy the WSUS content from that server as well. So what I'm going to do is just make a folder called WSUS. Now, this server isn't really spec'd out with multiple disks like you would likely want to do. Maybe you have WSUS on a different drive. But for the use case that we're having here, we're just going to put it on the C drive. So if I come back to my main server, let's take a look at our disk. And then we're going to copy all the content from the current WSUS folder. So we can see we have our WSUS content. This would be where like third-party updates get published. So for example, there's Chrome. and then also the update services packages, which is where third-party updates get kind of staged out when they're being signed. So we'd want to make sure we grab both of these folders, and there are going to be some folders in WSUS content for end user license agreements for Microsoft updates as well. So what I'm going to do, just to keep this simple, shouldn't be a problem. We'll just use File Explorer. We're going to copy those folders to the remote server that we're going to install WSUS onto. All right, so at that point, we've got kind of the two big pieces that we're going to need in order to install WSUS, but install it in a way that it's going to have all the content from our current WSUS server. So jumping back over to that remote machine we're going to install onto, what I'm going to do is open up SQL Server Management Studio. I did just install it. It said it needed a reboot, but hopefully we'll be good to go here to try to connect. All right, now if you are going to try to reattach a database and use it, you do need to make sure you're using the same WSUS version. So for example, the current WSUS server is running on Windows Server 2019, and then the new machine is also Windows Server 2019. So to be supported, I believe it is required that you need to restore the database on kind of the server running the same version of WSUS, which is really based on the operating system. So what I'm going to now do is choose to restore a database. And what I should have at the root of my C drive, because that's where we copied it to, we should have that backup file from the other WSUS server. So if I click on a device, we should be able to browse out for what we want to restore. So let me look at the root of C, and then I can see our back file that we copied to the $. So here we go. So it looks like it's got the data. Now for the files, what I'm going to do, you could restore it to the default SQL Server data folder if you wanted to. But what I have is I did put a SUSDB folder kind of on the root of C. Actually, I'm just going to put in the default SQL directory. That's probably better than something right at the root. But if you did have multiple disk for like databases, this might be like D databases, something like that, E drive. Just depends on how you have your disk spec'd out. But for this example, everything's on C, which probably isn't how I would do it in production, but should be okay just for this demonstration video. And then we'll just choose OK. All right, so at this point, the database is now restored. So all the metadata that has happened in WSUS and the products that you've enabled should all be the same now as your production WSUS server within ConfigMan. So at this point, now all we really have to do is install WSUS. So we're going to go ahead, do next here, walk through it. We're going to do WSUS here. There we go. And we want to use SQL connectivity. And then for the content folder, we're going to use that folder that we've already copied. So we're just going to put the root level of CWSUS. And then for the database, it's obviously going to be this server that we just attached our new SUSDB backup to. So it's just sitesystem.contoso.local. So we'll do next here, and then we'll choose install. All right, so WSUS is now installed. We're going to run the post installation configuration task just like we did before. But what should happen, we'll look at the temp folder in our profile. And here's the post install log. So we'll see if we can open that up. And you can see some stuff happening here. We'll come back once it's fully done. This might take a couple minutes. Alrighty, so we can see the installation only took a few seconds this time, maybe 30 seconds or so, so it was shorter than the brand new WSUS install. And the reason for that is we can see that it did in fact discover that it had an existing database for that SUSDB. So we can see that it basically detected that, and then because it's already there, it's assuming, hey, this is just reinstalling the WSUS role, but it's reusing the existing database. So it's a much quicker install versus having to create all those tables. So this only took a pretty short amount of time. So now that it's fully reinstalled, if we open up WSUS, let's take a look at this. Let's open up our updates here, all updates. And if we compare this, so for example, unapproved and then failed or not needed, we can kind of see there's a total of 620 updates, even though none are shown in this view, and we can see that we're on site system. Now, if we jump back to demo 2, which is our current primary, you can see it in fact has the exact same view as 620 total updates, and we're on demo 2. It looks like the view here is any except declined. So if I were to come over here and look at any except declined, we would expect to see 90 updates because it is using that exact same database here. Let's just show any status and then refresh. And we can in fact see this is the exact same database and the exact same view. So at this point, what we're going to do next is we're actually going to install an additional software update point. Once we install this new software update point, we'll then remove the SUP role from the current primary. Now, optionally, you could remove the SUP first from the site server, but just be aware, depending on other Windows Update settings, if there are no SUPs in the site, the clients could start scanning against Windows Update and start installing any update, even if not approved by ConfigMan. So what I'm going to do is we're going to create a new site system server. Now, a couple things to kind of point out. The computer account of demo 2, which is the site system, does have full administrative rights on the remote server that we're about to install on, called sitesystem.contoso.local. So that will be required in order to kind of connect in and be able to install the WSUS components remotely. We also have WMI enabled via the remote firewall. Just a few things that would be required kind of outside of the scope of this video. But what we can do now, we can just kind of search out for that server. There we go. And we're going to say demo 2 is the site we want to install onto. There we go. We're going to install a software update point. Default ports are good. So 8530, 8531 will typically be what you have if you're running server 2012 or newer. That's the default port, so that should all be good. And then we'll do next here. We're keeping things pretty basic. We don't have SSL enabled, but what we're going to notice is this should start the installation of the SUP. So if we look at the sitecomp.log on the site server, that's going to show the binaries being copied, as well as the service being executed that actually starts the software update point installation. So if we go back over to site system, if we look at the root of the C drive, we should see our SMS folder here, and these are the files that are kind of getting copied here to start the installation. So let's jump back. So yeah, it's currently trying to execute. Here's the files getting copied. There we go. So it looks like some are going to the admin $sign. So let's refresh, open this up. So we're getting some files that are getting copied. We should get a logs folder here in a couple seconds, and then we'll see things like the SUPSetup.log, which will show the installation of the software update point component that then connects to WSUS. So we'll give this a few minutes and we'll come back once we kind of confirm this software update point is installed. All right, so looking back at the site comp log, it looks like things are mostly finished up from the monitoring. So now if we jump back over to that remote server, we can see we have a logs folder. We can see the SUPSetup.log. So this is where you can just validate the installer for the component for the SUP was good. We can also check out the WSUS control that just makes sure that it can connect to the WSUS server. Now, if you do have the re-indexing task as well as some of the other maintenance, you will want to make sure that for your SUSDB, that the remote site system has access to that as well. So let's see if we can come in here and look at permissions. Yeah, we can see it doesn't look like the remote computer has access. So let's come under security, logins, and I'm just going to give the site server computer account rights to connect into this database. See if I can find that out. So locations, we want to do the domain. Let's just see. I'm not sure if that's going to find the computer account. Let me just see here. Demo 2. Oh, demo 2. Okay, actually, I think it might be the computer account of the current machine site system that may need access. So if I look at the existing logins, let's look at NT Authority's system. let's go to user mappings and let's go to SUSDB and let's just make that an owner so that the computer has access to do the maintenance to the database. So let's do a quick look here. And then what we'll do, just to see if that is in fact kind of what is being complained about here in WSUS control, what we'll do is restart the SMS executive service, which should cause this component to see if it then has access, and we'll see if that is in fact what was being complained about in WSUS control.log. There we go. Yeah, we can see it then successfully connected. So yeah, just the computer account looks like did not have full control of the database in order to do some of those cleanup tasks. So this looks good now. And the reason that wasn't set is usually on the site server, the system count has sysa for all databases. So this would be a little bit different now that it's remote and it's just the WSUS database that we installed here. So just be sure you want to make sure the computer has access to perform actions against that database so it can do the cleanup task that would be running under the computer account of the WSUS server. So at this point, it looks pretty good. So we should have our both software update points appear to be now functioning. So if I go back to my site, what we should be able to do now is basically remove it from demo 2. So I'm then going to click on remove role, and we're going to remove the software update point from demo 2. Because this is currently the top level SUP, we're going to say we now want site system to be the top level software update point that synchronizes with Microsoft updates. So I'll choose OK on here. Back on the site server, we then look at that same sitecomp.log. That's going to be what initiates the uninstallation of the software update point role on the current site server demo 2. So we'll see that kick in. And then what we should see is the SUP-setup.log is going to exist on our site server log files that will show the deinstallation of the software update point. That should likely show up here in a couple of seconds. There it is, SUP-setup. So we can see it did in fact just deinstall the SUP. So, this was all pretty quick. So one thing to kind of make sure that we're up and running is we could go ahead and trigger a software update point synchronization. So I'll go ahead and click all software updates. And then one other thing we could look at is the WCM.log, just to make sure like the uninstall kind of looks good. And then it connected to site system, which looks good. And then wsyncmgr, we'll kind of take a quick look over here. And what we should see in the next couple seconds or so, we'll see that it should start triggering our software update point sync from site system. So we'll give that a second and we'll come back just to make sure that things look good. After it does this configuration for WCM, it then should trigger the SUP sync, which we can see that's now taking place. So if we actually remote back over to site system and we open up the synchronizations here, we can see that it is in fact starting to sync from Windows Update, and then it will sync to the software update point for ConfigMgr Database. Now, one kind of gotcha that you will want to remember to do is, since this is a brand new server, we're going to want to make sure we add that to our boundary group. Otherwise, clients aren't going to go and scan against it. So I've got kind of a single boundary. This is a pretty simple site. Currently, it only had our references, it only had demo 2, but now that we have the SUP on site system, we also want to have a client start using that server as well within this boundary group. So I'll choose apply on that, and then we'll just wait to finish up the sync here. All right, so in our wsyncmgr log, we can see that it did in fact complete the synchronization and things look good. So if we come back over here, it looks like we have the exact same updates, no type of issues here. Now, if I jump over to one of our clients that are scanning against this site, we can also see that a few minutes ago, it detected the change. So it basically switched from demo 2 for the WSUS path. And if we look a few lines down, we'll see that it then detected the new SUP that it should scan against based on its boundaries are now site system. And we can see that clients have already redirected here once they got policy. So the only other thing to factor in here is that if you are doing third-party updates, you may need to reconfigure a couple things. So for example, if you're using our publisher, so let me just launch that. So we're back on demo 2 where WSUS was installed. We're going to want to basically export our settings. So if we come over here, we can then perform a export of our current settings file, and then we'll just call this patch my PC. If you're using the in-console publishing, it should just kind of swap over now that we've changed our software update points. So I'm then going to jump over, copy that settings file to my desktop. Now, one thing that I'm going to do is remove some of the WSUS components that are no longer required on our site server now that it's no longer our software update point. So to do that, I'm going to open up a PowerShell window and we're going to run get Windows feature update *update. So what this will do is shows all the Windows features that contain the word update. So then we're going to run a remove Windows feature. And what we do not need anymore, we don't need the database, or we don't need the core update services. So let me go ahead and uninstall update services. Go ahead and run that. Oh, remove. Looks like I got a typo. So we'll run remove Windows feature update services. All right, we can see that is now gone. So let me just clear this. So if we run the get Windows features again, we can now see a couple of uninstalls pending here for both the database as well as the services. So the only thing that we really need to keep on the site server is going to be the API components of WSUS, which are required in order for us to be able to connect to the remote software update point, because the site server still does interact. So in addition to that, on my demo 2, my old WSUS, I'm going to go ahead and detach the database as well, because we don't want to kind of get confused about something that exists that isn't actually our SUSDB anymore. So we'll go ahead and disconnect that as well. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick reboot just to make sure that WSUS removal takes effect on my site server. So while that's running, just because I know quite a few of you guys may be using our Patch My PC service, we're going to go ahead and kind of reinstall that on our new WSUS server that we installed. So just quick installation here. We're going to go ahead and launch it. And at this point, it's going to be a clean install. But over in the advanced menu, all I really have to do is just import that XML that we imported, or that we exported from our old one. So we'll go ahead and choose OK and then apply. Okay. And then the only real piece that is going to take into effect is your WSUS certificate does not exist anymore on the new server. So for example, let's see if our old demo 2 is up. Let's see if we can get back into that. So one thing to consider is, so if you open up certlm.msc, you will have your old WSUS certificate. So we can see this one is called Patch My PC Service. And this is one that we generated from our publisher. Now, the WSUS certificates that we generate from our publisher, by default, they allow you to export the private key. So the benefit to that is that if you move to a new server, you could reuse the existing WSUS signing certificate. Now, in the event that you had Configuration Manager manage the cert, they by default do not allow you to export it. So what that would mean is you would have to generate a brand new certificate and make sure that that's deployed to your clients from the new WSUS. But in our case, since we did generate it from the old WSUS and we allowed private key, we could actually come over here, we could copy that file we just exported, and then we could import that into the new WSUS. So that will make sure that clients still trust it because it's the same exact cert, and nothing else would change. So at this point, we're kind of configured. We should have all the same previous updates that we had enabled. If we look at our WSUS scan wizard, we should see all the existing third-party updates that were already published here as well. So these would be the updates restored via the database. If I go ahead and run a quick synchronization, we should see everything works perfectly fine. And from our tool's perspective, it's going to be just like if it was running on the previous one because everything was completely restored via the database. So there we can see we had all the same 5 updates already published, so they were totally skipped. So at this point, we've pretty much completed, I think, scenario 2, which if I look back over here, this would have been migrating our WSUS server to a new server and also restoring the SUSDB, the content, and the front end, and then replacing the site system and config manager to point to the new one, and then validate clients are successfully scanning against the new one. So I think that covers pretty much all of scenario 2. So if we look back here on demo 1, let's just give a quick look to see what we're up to here. There we go. So we can see it did in fact complete the scan. So at this point, if we look back into Config Manager, WSUS should be fully configured, and we should have everything kind of how it would have been before. So this all looks pretty good. The only other thing to consider is that our third-party updates have not yet been republished for scenario 1 where we've rebuilt the database. So if you were using any in-console third-party catalogs, at this point you could then resubscribe to them. In our case, let's go ahead and kick off our publisher, which we did start republishing some updates while it was synchronizing before, and we can actually see that they are showing up now in WSUS. So let's come into our software update point, and depending on when they were published during the sync, they may or may not be showing the Patch My PC vendor here. Looks like we did get that in time. Now, if you didn't see this, you could simply run another synchronization after the updates get republished, and then it should show up. You can check it and then click apply. Once you've then enabled it, all we need to do is run another software update point sync. So if I come back into all software updates, let's go ahead and start a synchronization again. And hopefully this time, once this kicks in, what we'll see is the third-party updates should now sync in for the newly republished ones now that we have the product enabled. All right, so we can see the synchronization is just finishing up, and we can see some of those third-party updates kind of flowing in here. So if I refresh, I can see I went from 163 to 168, and we now have the 5 new third-party updates showing up. So at this point, we did a brand new rebuild, and everything is fully functional. Now, one thing I do want to mention back for scenario 2 is I don't think I did go into IIS and check for best practice configurations for that new SUP. Let me just double check myself. I might have, but I don't think so. No, so I didn't here. So for example, this was where we want to change this from 1 to 2000. We also want to change the memory limit to be unlimited by setting a 0. And then there were a couple of other ones over here. Let's see what they had here. I think the idle timeout for 0, you'd want to double check with the docs that I included. I think this was false. So we'll then choose OK. And I think that that was most of the best practice configurations. And then we'll just recycle the app pool for WSUS. So at this point, we've pretty much completed both scenario 1, which was a full rebuild. We then did scenario 2, which was a backup to a new server, restore, install the SUP. And what I'll do next for scenario 3 is let's come back over here. And what we're going to do is reset our site system back to a clean state before it was our new software update point for scenario 2. And then we'll basically reuse this for scenario 3, which is if you're using the same database. So let's get that booted up. And let's jump over to our demo 3 server, which we're going to use for scenario 3. So if we look back over on the scenario 3, this one was essentially, we want to move our WSUS server for the front end. So this would be our content that we have, as well as the front end server where clients scan, to a new server, but we want to keep the existing SQL Server as the database. So this would probably be pretty common where, let's say that you installed your software update point for demo 3. If we look over here, this is on our site server, right? And let's say that you wanted to move the software update point where clients are scanning against to a different WSUS server on the front end, so that it's not on the main site server, but you want to reuse the existing database. So this is a scenario that could happen, and we'll kind of walk through what that looks like. So for this example, we have our SQL database running on the demo 3 server, and that's going to remain the same. All we're really doing here is making the site system the WSUS server that then connects to that database. So for this example, we're going to do some pretty similar stuff. So let me jump over to our site system that's been reset. We can see it doesn't have WSUS. It doesn't have anything else running on it. And first step I'm going to do is go ahead and make that WSUS folder. So we'll go ahead and do OK on that and then do OK. So next up, what I'm going to do is just make sure that we don't have any synchronizations that are about to run on our current demo 3 WSUS server. So let me just minimize this and just check wsyncmgr, and you can check kind of your sync schedule. Make sure there's nothing coming up while we're doing all these configurations. It looks like there's not really any scheduled sync for a while. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and copy my current WSUS folder, which would include all our third-party content as well as any EULAs that we have. So let's copy these two folders for the service packages and content. And we're going to do something pretty similar where we just go out to site system. In this case, I'm putting on the C drive. This could really be any drive on that remote machine. And I'm just going to copy over that content from the current WSUS server to the new one. So at this point, we've got basically a replica of that exact same content. So at this point, we're going to go over to site system, and then we're going to install WSUS. So what we'll do, go ahead and choose add a feature, do next here, next here, next here, and then we're just going to do WSUS, similar to what we did for scenario 2. The only real big difference is going to be the database here. So if I uncheck WID, we do want to use SQL. For the content location, this is going to be the folder that you just copied all the stuff over to, and we'll do next here. We're then going to store the updates kind of in this local folder because we are going to do away with our current WSUS server. Now, if you did have multiple that you wanted to run, you could use like a UNC share for your WSUS content if you did in fact have multiple WSUS servers that were going to share the same database long term. But for this example, we're basically removing the old one, and this is just temporarily that we're going to be running both WSUS servers. So this is kind of the important piece. This is where you want to connect. If you didn't plan on changing the database server, you would need to connect to whatever your remote database server was. So in my case, it just so happened to be actually demo 3. I don't want to mess that up. It just happened to be, if I jump over to demo 3, my SUS database was running on the same site server. Now, in some cases, you might have a remote SQL, even if your WSUS server isn't on that remote SQL. So this would be whatever the database is running for the WSUS server that you essentially want to connect into and reuse the database and not have to rebuild like we did in scenario 1. So we're going to just connect into that existing SQL server and then choose to install. Shouldn't take but a little bit. Now, once I actually run the post installation command for this, it's actually going to be pretty similar to scenario 2, where it's going to detect that there's already a SUS database installed here. The only difference is, this one's going to be remote as compared to in scenario 2, we actually restored the database to the WSUS server. All right, so the main role service is now installed. We're then going to run the post install task, and that should take a couple minutes. We can see the WSUS post install in the temp directory, and we'll see this kick in here in a few seconds. All right, so we can see everything looks good here. This would be very similar where it also detected the database, so we should see the exact same lines in here where it detected the database already exists, so it switched to kind of upgrade mode. And then, we're good to go here. Now, one thing that I will go ahead and run ahead of time, just because we know it's going to be needed, is we'll add site system. So let's come back to demo 3 for our SQL server. Let's go under... Actually, since it's remote, we'll test it out. We'll see if we get that same access denied error that we got before. But at this point, we should be pretty much good to go from the WSUS perspective for site system. So we've got that kind of fully installed, and it's using that remote database that is demo 3. So now what I'm going to do is go back over to my ConfigMan environment, and I'm going to go ahead and choose to create a new site system server. So this will be essentially the same exact thing we did for the other scenario too, where we just add that to our site system, where we add that to our site. So we'll go ahead and do OK, and kind of a next here. We just have to make sure that computer account of the site server is also local administrator so it can connect in. So we'll do a software update point, all the same defaults, and then we'll do OK here. So at this point, if we come back to our logs on our site server, just minimize all this out, we should be able to open up that sitecomp.log. So this is going to show it copying the files in order to install the software update point role here. So we'll take a look. There we go. So we can see it's copying some files to the admin $. So that's essentially the Windows drive. So let's actually come over here and see if we can find what it's doing. So it looks like it's copying some stuff over to Windows. So here's is.log. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's related. But we can see that SMS folder is now getting created over on that remote server, just like it did in the other scenario, because at this point, it's really doing the same thing. The only difference is the WSUS server is using that remote SQL server rather than the one directly on the WSUS instance itself. So we'll give this a few minutes while this is installing, and we'll come back. Okay, so it looks like the install is just finishing up here for the SUP. Let's look at our logs. Look at our SUP setup, and we can see that it was successful. Now let's see if we still get that same error in WSUS control. Nope, it looks good. It looks like since the database is also running on the site server, it was able to give it the correct permission. So this all looks very good. So at this point, if we come back into demo 3, we should now see that we have multiple software update points. Let's take a look over here. And we can see this one is kind of finishing up its final config here. So what we'll do next is let's try to say we want to get rid of that SUP from our primary for this scenario. So we'll go ahead and choose remove. And then at this point, we're going to choose the site system is now the primary, very similar to the other scenario. So we'll go ahead and do OK on that. And then what we should see is that same sitecomp log. We'll see the deinstallation kick off here in a second as well. And then that's where we should see the SUP setup.log on our site server perform the deinstallation of the software update point. There we go. We can see it starting that off. And there's the SUP setup.log, and we can see it's now successfully removed. So at this point, just to make sure that we're actually good to go, let's go ahead and just try to trigger a software update point synchronization. And that will just make sure that the site system, the new remote SUP, is functioning correctly. So we'll open wsyncmgr. And then what we'll also likely see is in the WCM.log, it's going through and it's kind of finalizing that it deinstalled, and we'll have that 1 minute wait period where it completes it. So after that 1 minute period, we should see the synchronization kick in WSyncMgr. So at this point, we're going to do something pretty similar where there's no longer a need to have, let's take a look. Yeah, there should no longer be a need to have the WSUS components installed here. So let's do get Windows feature and then just wildcard on update. Oh, so I have a typo there, wildcard on update. All right, so I'm going to remove the WSUS service. So we'll go ahead and do remove-Windows feature. And then we'll get rid of that update services from the demo 3, which used to be the primary software update point, but is no longer needed. Now, in this case, we're not obviously going to detach the database because the remote site system.contoso.local, it just so happens the SQL was also running on the site server. But what should happen is once this is kind of finalized, the WSUS service, the main core service, will get automatically removed. So it's a little bit less confusing of is WSUS actually running on this server or not? So we can just see a restart is needed. So just because we are currently waiting on the sync to run back on site system, we can see that in the wsyncmgr.log. Let's just go ahead and come back over here on site system, and let's just make sure WSUS is kind of up and running. And then we can also make sure that everything looks good. So if I look at syncs, I can see it's currently running the synchronization. So it looks like that's done just a few minutes ago. So this should kind of finalize here, and then we'll reboot our server to make that change take effect. Now, the only one thing that we haven't done yet is make sure our boundaries are good. So now that site system is the new software update point, we do want to make sure we have that in our boundary group, similar to what we did in scenario 2. So we'll go ahead and go to members, we'll go to references, and we'll go ahead and add that in here. And that's just going to ensure that clients will be able to scan against the new SUP. So what I'm going to do, let's go ahead and log into a client that's pointing to that lab for demo 3. So what we should see in a couple minutes once policy kind of kicks in, oh, there we go. So we can see it just swapped over to determine that site system is now the new software update point. So once the scan actually kicks in, if we look at ScanAgent, we can just verify that the scan did complete successfully, which does look like it did. So at this point, let's go back over to demo 3. Looks like the sync has completed. So the only other thing that we would just run here is just restart the server and make sure that everything is good once it's back up. So we'll go ahead and restart here and then OK. All right, so the demo 3 site server is now rebooted. So lastly, if we look at WCM, we can verify that it is successfully configured after the reboot. So this all looks good. We've essentially swapped over to the remote WSUS server. The only other thing would be for third-party updates. For example, if you were moving from like our publisher, what you would do is do the exact same scenario that we did for scenario 2, where you back up the settings, restore over, and then import the certificate or generate a new one in the event that it wasn't exportable from your previous WSUS server. Outside of that, hopefully this video was helpful, and thank you for watching.